Well, good morning, everybody. Today is Friday, August 17th, 2018. And today in our Leader as Coach class, what we're going to do is a boundaries review. And the reason we're going to do a boundaries review is because in one of our group sessions yesterday, we were having a lot of conversations about relationships and getting charged and getting triggered, etc. And one of the things that I was thinking about this morning is how, as we think about coaching and we think about being in a leadership position and creating a space to effectively coach people, or even being more coach-like in our personal relationships, whether in the role of parent or in the role of friend or within our family, the coaching skills, every single coaching skill that we can use to create a powerful, positive dynamic in the relationship cannot be done if you don't have clean boundaries. It just can't be done well if you don't have clean boundaries. But if you do have clean boundaries, it can be done really well and really easily. So I don't know if boundaries is really at the core of, I don't know if it's the only thing that is at the core of being able to coach well, but I do know that it's a very important factor. So I want to go over the boundaries model really well, but then I want to take it a step deeper. So first of all, let's review the boundaries model for anyone that hasn't heard of it yet or hasn't seen this version of it yet. So the boundaries model that we've created at Aspire, it's kind of the best way that I've seen to explain boundaries. So a lot of people talk about boundaries, and there's a lot of maybe different ways that people explain boundaries, but this is the way that I see boundaries. And the one thing that I read once that made the most sense to me when it comes to boundaries is that having boundaries is what tells you in a relationship who is responsible for each other's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And when you ask yourself that question, you know, the answer is really actually fairly clean. You know, it's supposed to be that I'm responsible for my thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and you're responsible for your thoughts and feelings and behavior. But if you look and think about your real relationships, typically when you get emotional in those relationships, one of the reasons that you're emotional is because you've either slipped into taking responsibility for somebody else's thoughts, feelings, or behavior, or you've slipped into giving them responsibility for your thoughts, feelings, and or behavior. So let's look at, so I made the spectrum of responsibility. And at the me end of the spectrum is I'm taking responsibility for everybody's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And at the you end of the spectrum, I'm giving everybody else responsibility for my thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And I wanted to give you kind of a sense for what it might feel like at various points in the spectrum. So kind of towards the middle, but on the me side, it gives you a lot of awareness and compassion. So if I pay attention to the impact of my behavior on others, and I notice how I affect other people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior, that's still pretty healthy. That gives me a lot of compassion, and that gives me a lot of emotional intelligence, because I can understand how I affect other people's behavior, and I can shift my own behaviors to create a space for other people. And that space can be healthy, and it just keeps the relationships pretty healthy. It's kind of good to know how you affect other people. But you could take that to a little bit of an extreme, and you can do what I call over-empathizing. And that could be if somebody's sad, then you start feeling sad. So you start getting infected by other people's emotions, and you fall into them. And another coach once told me that there's a difference between empathy and compassion. And as a coach, you actually don't want to feel empathy. It's better to feel compassion. And I thought to myself, well, what in the world is the difference between empathy and compassion? But what he said, which I never forgot, is that empathy means you're actually feeling the same feelings as the other person, or at least you're feeling what you imagine the other person is feeling. And compassion is you're still in a pretty healthy space yourself, you're still feeling calm, confident, whatever, but you have an understanding and a compassion for where they're at and where they're feeling. And it's kind of like if your client was falling into a snake pit and you're the coach, and you can hold out, if you're in compassion, you can hold out a stick and pull them out of the snake pit. But if you're empathizing, you're jumping right into the snake pit with them, and then you don't have really any way to help them get out of it. So that's what over-empathizing is. And then I also clicked onto rescuing, and rescuing is an extreme form of taking responsibility for everyone's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And that's when you just assume that what everyone else does is your responsibility. So that's where the helicopter parent might be classified. That's where codependent behavior might show up. But that's where, you're almost controlling everybody's behavior. But a leader often will micromanage others because they're too afraid that if they leave others to their own devices, they won't do a good job. So they end up over-monitoring other people's behavior. But there's a really good reason for that. It's because they're afraid, oh my gosh, if I let them go, there's going to be a lot of mistakes. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, we'll kind of go in the same direction. If you give other people responsibility for their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, then you can have a sense of confidence and allowing that's really empowering. So if you allow other people their opinions, for example, if you are too messy in your boundaries, you could be too concerned about what other people think of you. But if you say, well, you know what, if they're upset with what I do, that's their responsibility, not my responsibility, to a certain extent, that can be really empowering. Because if other people get upset, you can make better decisions. As a leader, you need to have a certain amount of confidence so that you can allow people to have negative opinions of you. And we've talked about people-pleasing. When we have this confidence in allowing, that's very healthy because it protects us from the angst that comes with people-pleasing. And I think someone earlier on the call was talking about how easy it is to make decisions when you have clean boundaries, because you're not worried about whether what you say when you say no upsets people. You're not worried about a decision upsetting people so that you can make decisions more effectively. So that's very healthy. But if you sort of inch down this, again, you can get to a place what I call offloading. And I ran into someone, I will never forget this person because she used to surprise me. She'd gone through landmark training and she really felt like she had great boundaries. But she would do things that really upset people. And anytime anyone tried to talk to her about how her behavior upset other people, she would say, you need to make a request to me and you're responsible for your own feelings. And so where that went wrong for her is it almost seemed to others that she was being really callous, that she was basically offloading responsibility for the impact her behavior was having on others onto other people. So she's basically saying, well, I get to be however I am, and if you're upset with me, then that's your problem. It's not my problem. That didn't do her well in her relationships. It didn't serve her well in her relationships. People didn't like working with her because they didn't feel like they could trust her to be compassionate towards them or to be concerned with how her behavior affected them. And then you can take that to a real extreme, which is blaming. And that's when everybody stands around the water cooler blaming management for everything that goes wrong with them. So that's kind of the overview of the spectrum of responsibility. And we talk about the center area as the clean boundaries zone or the healthy zone. And it's probably kind of obvious why that's the healthy zone, just basically based on how I've described everything. So we won't go into that in any more details. But what we are going to talk about is how does it feel when your boundaries aren't clean, and what does it take to move yourself to a healthier place? So we had a little bit of a discussion circle before we started the recording, and people shared how they felt how they felt when they had messy boundaries versus how they felt when they had clean boundaries. And here's some of the things I remembered that people said. So people said, I feel anxious, I feel resentful, I feel angry, I feel incompetent, I feel helpless. These are some of the things I feel when I'm in a situation with somebody else and my boundaries aren't clean. When my boundaries are clean, I feel confident. It feels easy to say no. The relationship feels easy. Requests don't feel like a burden. And, kind of things move around. So we were able to define a little bit of the difference between what it feels like when you have clean boundaries and what it feels like when you have messy boundaries. Typically, when you have messy boundaries, there's a lot of negative emotion towards the other person. And also, it can feel really, really draining, and the relationship with the other person can feel like a weight on your shoulders, or it can feel like it takes a lot of energy for you to manage. So when you have messy boundaries, it feels like it takes a lot of energy for you to manage that relationship, whereas when your boundaries are clear, it feels like it takes almost no energy at all to manage the relationship, and the relationship is more energizing to you. So how do you shift yourself from a place of messy boundaries to a place of cleaner boundaries? And these are some questions that you can ask yourself. So shifting to a better place, it's actually an emotional feeling you're shifting to. It's not really a mental place, but you can start with asking yourself questions mentally, and that will help you shift your emotional state. So one thing to think about is, what unmet needs are you expecting the other person to meet? So whenever you have a negative emotional reaction, you have an unmet need that's flaring up. If you're really upset with somebody else, or you're having a really hard time in a relationship, there's a good chance that you're expecting that person to meet your need. And so, as we all know, with needs, based on various different conversations and models that we've had about needs, whenever you have a negative emotion, you have an unmet need. Whenever you have an unmet need, chances are you're not giving it to yourself. And the whole process is you have to kind of open up your receiving zone so that you can receive the need from yourself and from other people. So the best thing you can do is become aware that you're expecting someone to meet your needs. Assure yourself that you're going to get your needs met, but get rid of the expectation that that particular person meet your needs in that moment. So that kind of thinking can help you move to a healthier place. Another question to ask yourself when the boundaries are very messy is, what are the outcomes that you're attached to? So what are you thinking has to happen that if it doesn't happen is going to be really horrible? Like, does this person have to like you? Does this person have to understand you? Does this person have to validate you? Does this person have to, it's my child and they have to get good grades? Is something horrible going to happen if your employee doesn't understand and change their behavior and start performing better? So these are the kinds of things that you have to think about. What outcomes am I attached to? And then what stories are you telling yourself about who they are being? Chances are you've got something in your head that says this person's being a complete jerk, or some form of that. And so just pay attention to that. What story am I telling myself about who they are being? What judgments am I coming up to in my head about them? And remind yourself that those are your stories that you're creating, and they probably have more to do with you than they have to do with the other person. So you want to take responsibility for your own stories or your own thoughts. And what stories are you telling about who you are if you let go or if they don't respond well to you? So one of the examples I gave in our initial discussion is in my relationship with my daughter. When we have clean boundaries and she asks something of me, I usually feel fine about that. I'm kind of happy because it gives us mother-daughter time, and even if it's me doing something for her, like braiding her hair or taking her shopping or something like that, when my kids ask me things. But when I have messy boundaries and my kids ask me things, I feel very resentful of them, and kind of angry that they would expect all this of me, and also angry that they don't appreciate me. And the story I'm usually telling myself, if I actually think about it, is that it's impossible for me to be a good mother. And there's various different versions of that story. Sometimes I'm thinking I'm a bad mom because I haven't raised my kids to do things on their own, and I just let them walk all over me, and that makes me a terrible mother. But sometimes it's the other story about how I just don't give my kids enough, and I'm not nurturing enough as a mother, and I leave them alone. So I can have one story or another story, but the story about me is, am I a good mother or not? So that's a story that I'm obsessed with. And when I get obsessed with that story about myself and I project it onto them, that's messy boundaries. That's kind of making them responsible for whether or not I feel like I'm a good mother. So things to think about. These things will help you start sorting through your feelings in a relationship when things are starting to get really chaotic. And then, how do you talk to yourself to move yourself to a better place? Well, there's a few things that you can do. The first is, if the worst happens, I can handle it, and this is how. So typically, if we're over-attached to an outcome, typically we're in fear of a certain outcome happening. So if you're the leader in a department and someone's not getting something that you're trying to explain to them, then, the worst that can happen is that they continue to do a bad job and you have to fire them. And maybe you are feeling like you just can't deal with firing them. Or another thing might be that they might fail, or maybe they'll hurt themselves, or maybe they'll hurt you, or maybe they'll leave you. So if they leave me, then, or if I'm the one that gets fired, right? So all these things can be going through your head, and it really helps you to think about, well, what is it that I'm afraid of happening if this conversation doesn't go well, or if these interactions with this person doesn't go well, or if this relationship doesn't go well? What am I afraid of happening? Am I afraid of the relationship ending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And once you nail what it is you're afraid of, then you can talk yourself through how you'll handle that worst case outcome. That helps you be more detached from the outcome. Another thing is, I'll get my needs met no matter what. So when someone's treating you in a way that feels disrespectful and you're starting to react, usually it's because your need for feeling respected, for feeling good about yourself, is being trampled all over in that relationship. So if you remind yourself, one of our participants was telling us that it helped her to remind herself that she's a good person, to remind herself that she doesn't deserve this type of behavior. So it helped her set the boundary and stop receiving the disrespectful comments or the condescending or the sarcastic comments. So she had someone going off on her that was telling her, that was basically putting her down, telling her a lot of stuff, and poor boundaries would just have you receiving all that and taking it and saying, yes, they're saying all this about me, so maybe all that stuff they're saying about me is true. But if you had clean boundaries, then you might say something different in your head, like, okay, well, they're upset, so they're calling me names and they're saying all these things, but that's about them being upset. It has nothing to do with who I really am. And all these negative things they're saying about me, they're just projecting onto me. That has nothing to do with who I really am. So you're basically saying, I'm going to feel good about myself. I'm going to feel respected and like I'm good enough, and all of those things that I need to feel good about myself, no matter what this person thinks of me, no matter what this person is saying about me. Also, there's other people I can count on. So if this person that you're in a relationship with is really important, a lot of times it feels like they're the only person in the world that matters when it comes to what they think of you. And if you're able to say, I can't get support or positive regard from this person, but I have other people that really love me and support me. Reminding yourself of that can help. And this last bullet, this behavior doesn't mean anything about me, is what we've sort of already touched on. So this is a summary of how you can take a look at the boundaries model, pay attention to the emotions that are going on in your relationships, notice when your boundaries are not clean, and move yourself to a place of clean boundaries. This is something you want to practice in all of your relationships, because when you are in a place of clean boundaries, and I'm going to kind of back us up to the boundaries model, when you're in that center of the spectrum, you're in a place of ease. And when you're in a place of ease, it really helps you listen better and do all the coaching skills better. So this is going to take a while to go back, but you'll be able to listen better. It's a lot easier to create a safe space for growth and self-reflection. It's a lot easier to empower and inspire others. It's a lot easier to identify patterns and challenges and give people feedback and make observations, because you are not attached to how they take it, but you're also very gentle and compassionate. So I'm going to turn the recording off, and we're going to have a discussion in our class. But for those of you who are just listening to the recording, as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about this more.